Hello. So I'm on the side of a hill here in a park, so I'm hoping that it's not going to be too windy. So today we're looking at Aristotelian virtue ethics by way of the Greek author of Professor Eleni Papali. And so she's connecting it to social work and likewise education. And so one of the reasons why I have students read this paper in particular is number one, she makes the theory accessible. And then likewise, we should always understand that no matter what discipline we're looking at, we're always thinking of ethics as relational. So even if we're thinking of environmental ethics and environmental work, if we're thinking of environmental work, that's always as well about a relationship with people as well. So not only is there a relationship with the environment, but there is a relationship with people, plain and simple, and likewise how it is that we're becoming educated as well. So the act of educating ourselves also is important, not only for environmental ethics, but also understanding virtue ethics and understanding Aristotle as well, because he thinks of virtue ethics in terms of building of character. And so as Eleni Papali points out, virtue ethics has to do with questions of who am I, who ought I become, how ought I get there. And so this is in contrast to rule-based approaches such as deontology, and then also often distinguished as non-consequentialist. So in other words, if it's non-consequentialist, what you're basically pointing out is that it is based on principle, and that means that it's based on reasoned principles as a means of justifying moral behavior. So moral behavior is justified by way of a rational principle that is based in character, and that is a way that we're thinking of virtue ethics, okay? So to be distinguished from deontology as well, but deontology is also non-consequentialist. So to be also distinguished from, say, utilitarianism, which is consequentialist, right? And so what else? So then the way that we're thinking of virtue ethics is as a means of understanding our character, okay? So in other words, when we're looking at the questions, who am I, what ought I become, and how ought I get there, we're thinking about how a character is understood in development in a lifetime. So this is what's called a eudaimonic practice. In other words, it's a practice that is aimed toward eudaimonia, and that's another way of indicating that your life is aimed toward living toward goodness. So it is teleological, so similar to what we were pointing out with Stoicism and likewise Epicureanism and natural law, and then also the way that we're understanding cynicism and also deontology is usually this way of thinking about our aim toward the good. The teleology toward the good is a way that man is working and practicing and understanding his or her character in time, right? So thinking about ethics is always a dynamic approach, and it's dynamic in the sense that you're thinking of practice. So the ancient art of doing ethics is known as the philosophy, as practical philosophy. So this is practical philosophy because it's getting us to do the right through a way of working by virtue. Okay, so in a way of working by virtue, we're going to have to ask ourselves then, first and foremost, what is a virtue, right? So if we name 4 virtues, say courage, justice, practical wisdom, and temperance, these are ways of understanding our character and ways that we are working toward developing our character by the example of others. So we see the example of others and read about and think about the example of someone being courageous, and that's how we understand it better. So it's through lived experience and also by example, okay? And so the way that we understand what courage is, or the way that we understand what justice is, or practical wisdom, or temperance, is by way of what's called the golden mean, okay? And so don't ever misunderstand the golden mean to be the golden rule. It's tempting for students to do this, but the easiest way to understand working through the golden mean in terms of virtue ethics is really that the golden mean is a rational way in which we understand what virtue is. So if we give a definition of virtue as excellence of character, then we're seeing that that excellence of character is a mediation between the extremes of privation and the excesses of rashness. So in other words, being too hasty is the extreme of courage, whereas being cowardly is a privation or a lack of courage. So in other words, that's our way of understanding the golden mean, and so that's a means of rationalizing virtue in order to understand what virtue is. So in other words, understanding the golden mean is a way that we rationally understand what virtue actually is. It's a way of placing virtue in our mind by way of a rational procedure. Because remember that for Aristotle, our centered way that we understand something is by way of reason. In other words, we structure the way that we understand our character by the golden mean, and that golden mean is a way of negotiating between the extreme and the privation. And the act of doing that, in theory, is the way that we understand whether the act that we're about to perform is rationally understood as virtuous, okay? And so what we're doing when we're thinking of virtue ethics is seeing this mode of thinking and this way of understanding the theory as something that we're working through as a habit, okay? So the big word habit is really important there, because it's getting us to start thinking of this as not necessarily instinct, but rather a way that we act where we're going to be better adept in the future at dealing with situations courageously, okay? And so one of the tough things for students to do with virtue ethics is not only to understand what courage is, or what justice is, or what practical wisdom or temperance is. That's hard enough. But how is it that those virtues in one's life become a way that you are interacting in the larger community? So in other words, I'm always emphasizing this idea of ethics as being not only about yourself, taking care of yourself, which is an ethical procedure, but likewise, how is it that we're understanding our relationship with other people? So if we're thinking about our relationship with other people in a community, we are then focusing on how it is that we are virtuous, i.e., what is our character? We're making that into a habit, and we're understanding that rationally / conscientiously, okay? So in other words, the way that we're understanding practical wisdom is the fancy word in Greek, phronesis. So that's reasoning through practical matters in terms of experience. So experience there is critical, because in order to act with experience, you have to have worked on the way you understand your character as a habit. You are then used to acting a certain way, And so when you're acting with vice often, or in a way that is toward the privation of virtue, in other words, you're not working with enough virtue, then that also becomes a habit. But that's not something that you want, because our aim is toward the good. Our telos as human beings aims toward eudaimonia / the good life. And in order to have the good life, we need to be in a good relationship with ourselves and our community, and also our environment, right? That in order to have a good life, one cannot have a discordant environment, right, as well. So I think that's a good baseline for our understanding of virtue ethics, thinking about how it's placed as an education for us in terms of understanding the theory, and a way of working through education in general by way of repetition and habit, right? Habits are brought about by thinking about things repetitively and working through things repetitively, making mistakes, and developing from there as a means of understanding our character. So I think that's a good way of starting out with virtue ethics, and we'll take it from there. Thank you, class. Bye-bye.